Welcome to Big Closet Small Planet and this special edition for the Scandinavian Textile Initiative for Climate Action's Climate Action Week. So we keep coming back to this topic, at least those of us who've been working in sustainability for decades. Those of us who've been focused on environmental performance and social justice and even business have been introduced to and been asking the question for a while about whether or not there are limits to growth. And of course, this title, this expression comes from a very famous report in 1972 called The Limits to Growth, which basically discussed the possibility that exponential economic and actually population growth within a finite supply of resources could be or was problematic. So this is not a new topic. But for many years and many years later, we continue to face the same question. Can we get there from here? And more specifically, if we use the apparel industry as a case study, can the apparel industry get there from here? We, of course, have to discuss what there means. But the idea, can the industry grow and operate within the environmental space of its planetary boundaries and the social space of justice and human rights and thriving? So I am very excited that an established industry organization in the textile apparel space wanted to explore this question head on. And so with me today are Beth and Rachel, two of the authors of a relatively new landscape analysis on this topic. It's a complex topic. On a short podcast, we're going to get a taste of it, and there's probably a multiple installment podcast in the future for this. But I hope it will stimulate some more questions. So Rachel and Beth, can you introduce yourselves, your organizations for the listeners? Let's start with Beth.
Sure. Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Beth Jensen, and I am the Senior Director of Climate and Nature Impact at Textile Exchange. I think we'll go into the organization in a minute, I suppose.
And hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Arthur. I'm an independent strategist and writer who has worked with various organizations across the fashion industry on systems change throughout my career, and with Textile Exchange specifically on this topic for the past few years, and ultimately is the author of this report on reimagining growth.
Okay, so you have this report, Reimagining Growth. Who wants to provide some context and background for the analysis? And Beth, again, you and I have had contact on this for a number of years. We've talked about the book of Jason Hickel wrote, and I know that you spoke. Jason spoke at a conference a while back. You've been thinking about this for a while, at least, Beth. So maybe you can start there and give us some background.
Yes, of course. So, Textile Exchange, we are the global nonprofit organization really supporting the fashion, apparel, and textile industry in its efforts to essentially use more sustainable materials and achieve some of our planetary impact reduction or beneficial impact goals through the lens of the materials and fibers that are used in our industry. And so one of the things that we do, or one of the things that we offer to the industry, I guess, is sort of progress checks on how are we doing against our, particularly for us, it's climate and nature impact goals. And the one that we've had in place the longest is a goal that is tied to the Paris Agreement. So a goal for the industry related to raw material and fiber production that says we need to achieve a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions related to raw material and fiber production in the industry by 2030, if we're to be considered, sort of doing our part to achieve at least stay as close as possible to the 1.5 degree pathway that we want to see across the world. And so what we did against this when we set this initial target was we put together a model basically that could help us provide annual progress to the industry on, how do we think we're actually doing against that goal? And when we put together that model, and we're continually revising that model. But when we initially put together that model, it really gave us a picture of what we're going to need to do as an industry in order to achieve that 45% greenhouse gas emissions reduction target by 2030. And one of the levers, so to speak, of course, is material substitution. I think that's what a lot of people who know Textile Exchange know that we've worked on for a very long time. So, what are less impactful versions of the materials that we use across the industry: cotton and polyester and leather and animal fibers and all of those things. And we absolutely need aggressive substitution, is what we would say, of toward less impactful versions of all of those materials. And that's, a great deal of what we continue to work on today as Textile Exchange. But the other interesting finding within that modeling was that if we started to play around with growth rates and assumptions related to growth rates, that was, that is equally something of equal importance for us to be focusing on as an industry, basically, in terms of its potential ability to help us achieve the climate target that we need to achieve. And so what we did, and none of this modeling is exact science. So, that's always the caveat here. This should always be considered directional. But just by playing around with kind of what that assumption or what those assumptions look like in terms of what a current sort of steady state growth rate is to be applied within the model, and then what would it look like if we reduced that growth rate within the model. And it really started to give us a picture of the importance of really looking at growth as part of our overall holistic set of solutions that are going to be needed to achieve that climate target. And again, that's just looking at a climate target. This is just looking at raw material and fiber use in the industry. But I think over the last 5 years that we've had this modeling in place, and we've continued to sort of update the industry progress, we've seen more and more sort of literature come out about this topic, both within and beyond the scope of raw material and fiber usage in the industry. And so that's what we really wanted to try to do with this report, I would say, is kind of bring together all of that knowledge and understanding in one place through the lens of our industry specifically, through the lens of the fashion, apparel, and textile industry specifically. And bring that all together in one place for the first time, I guess.
And so, because I brought up our conversation about Jason Hickel's book, and the fact that I recall the Textile Exchange had invited Jason, and Jason spoke to your membership at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And I recall this was before the report came out, of course. But was this happening at the same time where you're thinking, we did the calculations and now we have someone saying, maybe we should think about this issue more broadly?
Yep. Yeah. So we came out with what we call our Climate Plus strategy in 2019, I believe. It predates me at Textile Exchange. I joined in 2021. But at that conference, so we knew, so we had a sense that this was one of the levers that we needed to look at. And so, but just kind of starting to, I guess I would say, dip our toe into how do we kind of effectively bring this topic to the industry, or bring awareness of this topic to the industry as a starting point. And so I think inviting Jason to speak at the conference in 2021 in Dublin, the Textile Exchange conference in Dublin, was a really good first step to that, kind of providing a platform for this topic from someone who is a real expert, a deep expert in this topic. And I will also say that year, his book was one of the two my two highlight books that I read of that year, in 2021. It was Jason's book on degrowth, and then it was Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a deep regenerative agriculture book by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Both, through different lenses, but dealing with very much, in many ways, the same type of topic, is like, how do we rethink some of these systems that we're in a really meaningful and deep way. So anyway,
Okay.
so yeah, inviting Jason to speak at our conference was, I think, kind of our our idea of like, let's introduce this topic to the industry in a more formal way. And then we can use that as a jumping off point for starting to have some deeper discussions. And Rachel has been involved in that with us really since that conference in Dublin, I believe. Rachel, isn't that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ever since we've been having various conversations at each of the conferences and consulting with the industry, and all of that led to this place of creating the report as a kind of a home for all of this thinking and bringing it together in one place, as you said, Beth.
So we're going to get into now what initially at the top line, what are some of the key conclusions that you've drawn in the report? I just want to say from my own perspective, when you invited Jason to the conference, which I ended up not participating in that particular conference, I was shocked. And just to say, I was shocked because I was making the assumption that there's no way an industry organization like Textile Exchange can introduce this topic to a group of people who are sort of operating within a very, very traditional way of seeing business and the industry. And so someone like myself, who's been also aware of these topics for as long as I can remember and been struggling with them, was both shocked and pleasantly and happily surprised. So I think it just goes to show you a little bit about what assumptions, at least I was making, about what could be at least lifted up and discussed. And we're going to come back to that in a second in terms of.
Can I just mention one more quick thing there too? Let's recall 2021.
Yeah.
It was still like a number of companies couldn't travel to that conference that year because it was still the pandemic. It was still fully the pandemic. And so I think there was a little bit of a moment there too of like, we're just kind of rethinking everything right now. And so it was just this little window of like, I don't know if we had tried to start to introduce that now in this current moment, it would just be a different, I don't know. It might be a different
Interesting.
Calculus, about how to go about it. I think we would still want to introduce it in one way or another, but anyway, I just think the moment was the right one to introduce this. And I'm so happy that we did at that point in time.
Well, we're going to come back to that definitely then. But let's first, if you could summarize, I don't know if it's Rachel, you want to do it, but what are you think the sort of most important, I don't know if findings is the right word for the report, but the most important messages or results of the report that you want to highlight?
Yeah, sure. And I think Beth and I can probably jump between us with different things here, not because we have different key highlights, but there are obviously lots to mention. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that, to your point that you just made of the kind of surprise of having somebody like Jason Hickel on stage, that's because, this is, for want of a better phrase, because it's an overused phrase, but it is indeed a phrase in the report. This is the elephant in the room, or the elephant in the boardroom, as it's rightly called. That we overproduce, we overconsume, and this industry perpetuates that in every way, shape, and form because it is its primary measure of success. And one of the things we wanted to do with this report was to put that on the table, to just really explain why that's an important thing for us to acknowledge and what it actually means. The fact that the prevailing linear business model, so the notion of being about take, make, and waste, as well as the fact that this industry is so good at overstimulating demand, in a bid to maximize corporate profits. And I say so good at that because it obviously does a very good job of driving huge profits and does so in a very successful way. It's kind of the point of this is to recognize that comes with severe consequences, including, of course, environmental degradation and social inequality. And growth, as it has traditionally been defined, is deeply ingrained in the system that we operate in. And that's what I mean about us being very good at it. People talk about this notion that the system is broken, but actually the system's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's a huge part of corporate culture that business grows. That's what everybody is measured on in terms of success. That's how we consider value creation to be, etc. And in most cases, that pressure to prioritize that ways anything to do with sustainability goals, or that's what we see in the majority of businesses across this industry. It is about those short-term financial returns, and that's because growth is the sort of surest way that the industry can indeed achieve a growth in profit, is to continue to indeed sell more, and selling more is in the majority of cases done, as I said, in that traditional linear business model. So discussing anything that's different to that is seen as very radical, and that was kind of one of the reasons that we wanted to put this on the table. It's the same way that there was that decision to put Jason on the stage in the first place, is to say that there's an issue here, as proven by the modeling, as Beth outlined, and addressing it is a really important part of the sustainability conversation that we're having. And as a result, we really have to acknowledge and reflect on the difficulty that exists between that the financial imperatives that this industry is based on and the reality of finite planetary resources, and putting those two together. And part of the reason for the report was also the fact that just saying all of those things is a really important part of what the industry, and when I say the industry, I mean those in the sustainability space in the industry, need. We heard a lot from the consultations that this is something they're already aware of, but actually being able to take that to their senior leadership teams within the business is really challenging, because this topic is, as I said, a very radical topic to take forward. And so we wanted to be able to show why it's important, what we know about it, and what we don't know about it, and what we can be doing to address it. And so I think that was, part of the goal here was to say, let's lay it all out, and let's really show that it's important enough a topic to put forward, even though it's so contentious, even though it's counterintuitive to the norm for business. Because if we don't, we won't get to the sustainability goals before us. We won't contribute to those mass multilateral agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, as Beth mentioned. And focusing on business as usual is therefore not really an option. And I just wanted to add, to your point there about the surprise that came with the Jason Hickel speech and Textile Exchange as an organization doing this. This is why, for me, it was so valuable to work with Textile Exchange, because they have the courage and conviction to publish something like this, to take it out of a space that has thus far typically otherwise been in either an activism sense or an academic sense, and bring it into the business landscape, which is where I think it really needs to be able to be addressed. And I think it's also really important that with this work, we stop and we think a little bit about how we are all a part of this system. And even in our sustainability work, it's so easy for us to be in the weeds of it, focusing on the day-to-day and what it is we're trying to change. And we forget to look up and actually see that this mass landscape of overconsumption and overproduction just continues to grow and grow and grow, with the millions of new items flooding the market every week, the billions of garments being produced every year. And the frequency or ease with which they're obviously being thrown away, and the knock-on effect that has in different parts of the world. And we've normalized all of this. And I think what this report does is just take a moment and in its sort of collective explanation of what's happening, stops and says, why it's really important that this doesn't continue in the way that it does, and that sustainability as an industry within an industry won't achieve what it's set out to achieve if we don't look at this side of things.
You stimulate lots of reflections as I was listening to you, and we could go in different directions. I think it's interesting on one hand to say, when you put this out with an established organization like the Textile Exchange, you make something that has been articulated behind the scenes or in other environments sort of okay to talk about. I don't know if you agree with me there, but I got a sense that was somewhat what you were implying. My own experience is that these are conversations we've had for 30 years, but not specifically within the context of apparel and textiles. So in that sense, bringing something that you then do in your landscape analysis to look at the history of this and say, okay, this is not a new way of thinking, but it's a new way of thinking that we now can see demonstrated by what Beth said in the beginning. We can't get there from here when we do the math. It's pretty obvious. What do we need to think differently about? I also want to come back to this idea that, bringing this up to sustainability managers, bringing this up to their leadership, that to me is a challenging aspect, because if it's a system-wide problem, if it's built into the DNA of the economic model of the industry, there's a question about what can CEOs do about that, and shouldn't it be brought up instead to the policymakers who need to sort of reorganize the system and its incentives to enable a new set of leaders to develop businesses in a different way. But we'll come back to that, because I didn't want to cut short any kind of messages that were more specific from the analysis. So, Rachel, you did a lovely job of explaining and its value. Beth, were there some specific things you also wanted to emphasize?
Yes, absolutely. I think, and it really just builds on kind of what you both were just saying, but just the reality of the fact that, you know, this is it is the way the system is built today, and that is the reality. And CEOs today have a fiduciary duty to report growth, and that is the reality that we're working within. And that, we see that, we recognize that. I worked in a company previously as well, in a group of brands, and you see that. And so it's a very sensitive topic because of that. I will say, I think across the sustainability community and those who are sustainability professionals across the industry, they get it. They truly understand, overall what this is and the importance of it. Of course, there's always some, education awareness building there as well. But overall, you see the understanding of it. But also recognize that it is a sensitive topic, and as I sort of alluded to earlier, particularly in today's economic environment, in this very moment, in May of 2025, I think, it's sensitive for all the same reasons, but perhaps even a bit heightened. And so, a couple of the key takeaways that we really wanted to draw out within this landscape analysis report. One is just really recognizing the need to align on the right language, and we can get into more detail around this in a minute. But we did a bit of a survey out with the industry to understand kind of how they're talking about this currently, if they are at all, and we got some really interesting insights on sort of terms that are just a non-starter for them internally, for sustainability leaders and so forth with their executive leadership. And so that was really a great piece to it. It was quite a heavy focus for Rachel and I in the development of the report as well. But just this concept of how do we, because this is a business resiliency issue, it's a value creation issue, it's a it's a business issue. How do we put it? How do we help enable sustainability leaders to put this in the right terms so that that makes sense to others internally who aren't, necessarily in the sustainability space and sort of steeped in this type of thinking day after day? There are business and financial risks to not addressing this topic. And so, how can we, the other thing that we really wanted to draw out, of many other goals with this landscape analysis report, but was just to start to help enable, the right language that can be used effectively within companies to kind of help translate this, if you will, to the decision makers within companies.
Okay, very interesting. We have to come back to this, because your focus on within companies is interesting to me again. But let's talk about the language to the extent we can, because there's a lot of terminology and language in this space, isn't there? The one I will start with, and you can jump in and say, no, Mike, let's talk about this or that. So just push back. But the sort of basic, I think, conundrum conceptually for many of us, no matter how steeped you are in this, is the idea of a green growth model versus sort of a post-growth degrowth model. And then you call it reimagined growth as a way of encapsulating this. But if you're an optimist who thinks the system can work as it does, you say the only problem is we have not priced in the externalities for environment and social impact. And if we just tweak the system and reward environmental performance, for instance, climate reductions, climate investments, and penalize financially bad performance, the impacts, the emission increases, for example, we would be able to, at least in theory, shift the system to leverage the system in a way where it builds companies and growth in a way that, as you say, is a positive impact on the environment, if it's even regenerative in some sense. So maybe I'm using that to say, when you did the work and you started to unpack the terminology of growth, degrowth, green growth, reimagine growth, how did you think about that? How do you explain the differences at some sort of basic level for the industry? Oh, was that a hard question?
No. Rachel, you want to take this one though? Yeah.
I feel
Yeah,
bad asking it.
I mean, it's kind of a frustrating thing that there has to be such a big question, right? I mean, we knew this going into it, that language is just so important because it's this part that is so contentious. But it's frustrating because in many ways it kind of gets in the way from getting on with the work. But I think that's what makes it so important that this report really addresses it. So we didn't want to shy away from it for that very reason. But we also didn't want it to be a barrier, so that businesses almost use it as an excuse to not address this topic, because immediately it doesn't get tabled because of this very fact. You know, if you say degrowth in the room, and this is what the survey showed us, the majority of businesses just immediately see shutdown and sort of exclusion from the boardroom tables. So we wanted to break it down properly. And in the report, what we do is we explain what all these different terms actually mean. So there is a table that very distinctly outlines our definitions based on pulling together different academic literature on definitions across degrowth, green growth, post growth, sufficiency, well-being economy, the list goes on, and post-growth economy and regenerative economy principles were ultimately what we landed on, which I'll come back to. But we wanted it to be a bit of a go-to guide. And then to your question, central to this really was explaining the difference between what is degrowth, or indeed in more of the quote unquote degrowth camp versus the green growth camp. And I think this industry is fairly aligned with what you've just outlined, right? This essentially saying this premise of green growth, or we can call it responsible growth or sustainable growth, it's kind of all means largely the same thing. Essentially is saying that we can keep on growing so long as we also do the work to protect the environment alongside, in those different ways that you've outlined, and others. And that's a bit of a win-win, right? Much of this thinking is basically saying that we can expand, but we also need to lean into technological advancements and efficiency gains and so on to reduce our environmental impacts in the process. And in reality, what the sort of science shows us here is that this is not only really, really tough, but it hasn't been proven yet to be possible, and certainly not possible in a short time frame, and in a short time frame and on an ongoing basis. And that's the really important thing here. We are within a limited time frame to be able to do this work. As we all know, we have deadlines on this and targets on this. But also, if we're going to achieve it, we need to keep achieving it. It needs to be that environmental impact is coming down on a continuous basis, and we can't then start growing again. Environmental impact goes back up. So the report explains that there will be that this essentially as a premise, the premise of green growth is going to be insufficient to ensure planetary boundaries are not exceeded and livelihoods of workers are not further degraded. That said, it does support the notion of decoupling, which essentially means the separation of the two things of value creation and impact from a resource extraction perspective. It does support that through things like focusing on circular business models, driving more revenue from them. But essentially it's saying that this won't be enough alone. So we have to do this But that has to also be amid a more holistic approach to reimagining growth, as we've called it, and to considering the concepts of reduction and sufficiency as a part of that. And this is then what becomes the degrowth angle, which is then indeed explained in detail. And what we do is then stress how tough this word is to use, as I already said, and rather present a vision of what the industry needs to work towards, which we have suggested is in alignment with regenerative economy and post-growth principles. And essentially what this does is it calls for business success to be redefined from that's based on those sort of exponential increases in production and consumption volumes, which is obviously where we are today, towards more sustainable and ethical practices, prioritizing, really importantly, the well-being and prosperity for all stakeholder groups. And again, importantly, over the long term. So like every part of that sentence has been really considered. It's all of those things together. And the really sort of underlining point of all of this is that it's got to be considerate of both a social foundation and an ecological ceiling, rather than only financial measures, which is where we are focused today. So I think the language is really, really key here. And what we've really tried to do in the report is break it down and then ultimately say, we need to move beyond focusing on just which word we're using and get to the action part of all of this, which I'm sure we're going to come on to in our conversation.
I think it's quite interesting that you have made a conclusion, right? The report makes a conclusion, which is, even with efficiency gains or decoupling or green growth maximized, that's not enough, and that you've framed a vision for the industry based on particular word choices that are the vision for what success will look like. So that is so in some ways the reason I raised that, because it's not just a landscape analysis that says here's what the debate is about, but you've come to a conclusion that if you do the math, and this is not new in the broader context, there are in the European level, as you all know, discussions about how much the New Green Deal can get us to where it needs to go, how much decoupling can happen, and then reports that say we don't see how you can do this without a reduction in serious throughput and other, I wouldn't say degrowth, but the decoupling of green growth they don't think could happen. So you've come to the conclusion, you think you've done the math enough to say we can't get there with the green growth model. And I think that's interesting. That's a viewpoint that you're taking. Have I misunderstood, or you have taken that viewpoint?
I think generally, and if I can just hop in here. So as mentioned, as Textile Exchange, we focus specifically on what we call tier 4 in the supply chain. So the production, the initial production of extraction and initial production of raw materials and fibers that are used in the industry. This report definitely took a broader view, right? Because in order to do an appropriate, landscape analysis type of report, we needed to kind of zoom out and take that 30,000 foot view on this topic, bring in all of the available literature and research that would provide a good, well, whether you want to call it a sort of umbrella or whether you want to call it a foundation, whichever way you want to look at it, providing that broader kind of view of the topic. For Textile Exchange specifically, then how we look at this is to say, okay, and as we talked about, by the way, this is a bigger systems issue. This is not something that Textile Exchange will be able to solve alone. And we can get a little bit more into that as well. It's not something that even one industry can solve alone. But I think as we look at it then specifically from the lens of Textile Exchange and how we, what's our angle into this topic specifically, how can we, think about more specific action, then we think about, what does this mean in context of fibers and raw materials? And for us, that's kind of a twofold approach. That means that we need to fully phase out growth related to extraction of virgin fossil-based materials. And the wording there is very important. Virgin fossil-based materials need to be fully phased out. And we've said this previously in some other reports that we've done and some other, things that we've put out as well. And then with natural materials, they have this hugely important role that they can play in achieving our impact goals that, those natural materials and those who produce them can play in helping us collectively, achieve our impact goals. We do need to also ensure that the production of those natural materials is not having harmful effects on pristine ecosystems. So just kind of, it's a little bit more of a nuanced approach for that one, but also recognizing that we absolutely, value natural materials within this kind of new reality as well. But that looking at this, from the perspective of a virgin fossil-based material versus a natural material, it means different things, I guess, in terms of when we talk about this overall kind of conclusion, as you're saying, Michael, that we came to. And so that's just one example of, I guess, how this report can be sort of translated, if you will. And we can talk about different actions and things as we go along, or what we recommend as the pathways in the report and that sort of thing. But it's just sort of that zoom out and then kind of zooming into, okay, so then what does that mean for different kind of parts of our industry? And what I just talked about is kind of how we now are, how we would think about it as Textile Exchange, and how to use this report moving forward.
No, I'm very glad you anchored it in very specific aspects of what Textile Exchange does. So let's just expand on that just a bit more before we get into the broader pathway and actions. When you say then phasing out fossil-based materials, fibers, ending extraction of those sorts of things, and you say instead the goal is to focus on the regenerative side of things. Is that what you think should be happening? Because when I was listening to it, I was thinking also, if you believe that there's a limited amount of resources available out there, and the industry, as we talked about, continues to grow, there will be a need for more materials, right? Not less. If we phase out those fossil-based materials and move towards others, ideally these regenerative, the idea would mean that we would need to scale those up pretty significantly to meet the demand that's coming. And if the idea is that even if we scale them up, there could be too much of a demand, we could have still too much volume and too much pressure on the need for materials, and therefore there's still a limit to growth kind of thing.
Yep, you're exactly right. Let me stop you right there, though, because it's the language that I used is really important. We want to fully phase out virgin fossil-based materials.
Yes.
So that does not mean that absolutely means, let me put it this way, that closed loop circular materials that are made from everything that's already been produced that's out in the world. The reality is we have all this material already out in the world that, quite a large portion of which is synthetic material. We absolutely need to accelerate and find ways to use that material. And so what we talk about is moving toward a world in which, so the Ellen MacArthur Foundation definition of circularity includes both, sort of reference to closed loop recycled materials, reducing waste and efficiency, and improving efficiency, that kind of thing, but then also regenerating nature. So when you think about, when Textile Exchange, when we think about an overall definition of circularity, so, a circular economy moving forward, a circular system that includes both, circular, materials made using existing textiles, particularly for synthetics, because we cannot be extracting new fossil fuels to make materials moving forward. And coupling that alongside what we would call sort of sustainably sourced renewable materials, so regenerative, organic, et cetera, those that are, as mentioned, part of this kind of working in harmony with nature, leaving the planet and its people better than we found it, kind of.
Good. I appreciate you clarifying that. I just wanted to give your example a little more legs so we could understand the logic.
Again, within this report, we don't want to, this report was intended to be broader than just what Textile Exchange just our scope of work, right? So this is just sort of one example, and just to sort of clarify our position in terms of what we will be sort of focused on moving forward. But yeah, then, again, zooming back out to the broader scope of the report, there are a number of different pathways that we put forward that are all going to be needed. And probably others that we haven't listed there as well that are all going to be needed. And we can talk more about that in a moment.
Yeah. So let's do that. Name some of the pathways. We don't have to be exhaustive.
Well, Rachel, do you want to take this one, since I've already gone into detail about the capping virgin fossil-based resources and feedstocks pathway? So check. We talked about that one.
Capping.
Number one covered. Yeah, I mean, I can just give super top line on the rest of them. We have next on the list is producing fewer items of higher quality with their true value reflected in the price. So I think that does what it says on the tin, but really focusing on that piece on longevity. So again, keeping things in the loop, but also durability, so they are indeed reusable in a circular system. Then reducing overproduction through the use of advanced technologies. So this is the supply chain efficiency side of things. I think this is where the industry has been focused already, and it's the sort of the easiest space to step into because there's a good business case for it. That this is going to save money basically. We know that we are overproducing way too much just in that sort of actual manufacturing sense. So this is that element. Then increasing revenue share from circular business models. So, beyond the reuse of the materials, how can we actually introduce services and scale services from a revenue perspective around things like repair, rental, resale, and so forth, which obviously we're seeing a lot of momentum in that space, but we need to see serious revenue drives coming from, so that revenue does indeed displace revenue that's coming from the linear model. And then there's a side of promoting equity and respect for human rights, ensuring decent work and living wages throughout the value chain. And if I might just spend one extra moment on this one to say that in the report there is an entire section on the need to really truly focus on a just transition with this work. I think when we mention the notion of reimagining growth, or indeed when a word like degrowth is said in any of these conversations, the immediate concern is, of course, about the knock-on effect that this has on those people who are working in the supply chain, particularly. If you talk about reducing the number of items produced, what does that mean for the people that are making them and rely on those jobs, essentially? And we saw this with the COVID-19 pandemic, right? As we've mentioned already, that was a time when obviously lots of things were being addressed, but there was a very, very negative side for workers in the supply chain when orders were cancelled, which I'm sure everybody will remember, when garment workers then were suddenly not paid. And this was unbelievably detrimental to so many livelihoods as a result. Indeed, a humanitarian crisis, as it was called out by organizations like Remake. And I think what we wanted to make sure that we did, and I should say, one of the reasons for that being the case was because it wasn't planned and it wasn't controlled, which is what strategies under the Reimagining Growth header call for. It's not saying that it needs to be instant, it needs to be controlled. And so we wanted to lay out in the report the fact that we have to consider the potential unintended consequences of any of this action from the outset. And we need to emphasize that Reimagining Growth has to support social justice and protect the rights, livelihoods, and well-being of people, to ensure ultimately that no one is left behind. So we really wanted to emphasize that. And we also wanted to make sure that we don't shy away from the topic of reduction within this, but we've got to show that this is necessary. But there are a multitude of ways to approach it so that these negative impacts, or any potential negative impacts, are alleviated, but also that there are opportunities created. And the report goes into detail as to what that should look like for people that are working in this space. So that's kind of all under the header of that particular pathway. But as I said, there's an entire section of the report that digs into that in much more detail. And then two final ones of the pathways that we have. One is around eliminating messages or sale tactics that are promoting overconsumption and obsolescence. So this is really around the role of marketing and the role of narrative, and how indeed the industry is sort of built on this model of indeed mass overconsumption, and how we can redirect some of that creative energy, but also budget essentially to promoting lower impact and circular solutions. And then finally, encouraging businesses to think about alternative ownership and governance models is key here. And I think sorry, that's not the final one. There's one additional one. Second final one is around alternative ownership and governance models. And then the very final one is around corporate advocacy. And this essentially is to say that within all of this, we need to see really ambitious government action, which again, I'm sure we'll come on to. But to do so, we need the businesses within this space to support that being the fact, as opposed to doing what we often see being the case, which is to lobby against it. And that the only way we can really level the playing field and move to a kind of market level transition with all of this is to have businesses and business leaders both demanding it and supporting it. And I think that's the only way that we will really see the industry shift, is by having that backing. So that's the final pathway in the list, and all of it is then sort of underscored and supported by the role that finance must play in this, and the role that policy must play in this as well.
Thanks, Rachel, for basically listing
It's a long, very detailed
the most challenging list that we can possibly sort of work through. Yes, brilliant. Thank you for being so articulate about it and brief, even though each of those topics in and of themselves requires a long discussion. I'm conscious of that we've spoken already for 45 minutes and we're just getting started. And so I don't want to open up so many new boxes, but there are a couple things that I want to try to address. I thought this was interesting because I see how you're trying to tie it together now. Initially, in the beginning of our discussion, you said, well, we have looked through the kind of language that should be used within companies and things that sort of trigger or are misunderstood, and, trying to find tools that sustainability leaders could use to bring this up. And when I was listening to you, I was thinking, I don't see it. I can understand as an individual leader, company leader, you can step back from your company and understand this problem. Many do, right? Many of the more thoughtful business leaders understand they're in a system. But I was worried when you brought that up that if that's going to be the target audience for the discussion, I didn't think you were going to come, or we are going to come very far. At the same time, at the end now, you've said we need the industry leaders, the business leaders to embrace this analysis and champion the new world that you're presenting that we need to go to. And again, I think, yeah, that makes sense. There needs to be people who honestly say, we agree with this analysis as a whole. But isn't it more important or more effective? And again, now I know I don't want to be black and white in terms of thinking. It's a holistic approach. But shouldn't the audience be the other stakeholders who are interested in ensuring the well-being of communities and society? That the policymakers, as you said, the leaders have to say, yeah, we see this analysis and we should understand this better, rather than relying on the industry itself and the established actors, the legacy actors, to drive this agenda.
Well, I would say it's not either or, it's both.
I knew you were going to say that.
I knew you
were going
know
to say
that's what I'm going to say. But we can talk briefly about the policy role here for a minute. I mean, I think that's absolutely going to need to be part of this systems shift, as Rachel articulated. It's one of the key pathways that we laid out. I think there are, as we're all well aware in this current moment, varying approaches to policymaking in various jurisdictions around the world. Speaking as someone sitting in Colorado and in the United States right now. Just to say, there has been some movement on relevant policy initiatives. So in the EU, there's the Waste Framework Directive. There's also been some extended producer responsibility bills in US states. Last year in 2024, even in the US, there was something called the Circular Economy Act that was moving. There was a slow fashion caucus that was established at the federal level in the US as well. Back in the EU, the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation is looking at including both recycled, and they what we're hearing is that they are going to define recycled specifically as sort of closed loop recycled, so not allowing plastic bottles to be considered recycled as part of recycled content, alongside also considering what sustainably sourced renewable content could look like within ESPR, considering durability, which is another part of this. And then, I would even just briefly mention, so with all the tariff craziness coming out of the US right now, one thing that has happened, which is super interesting as part of this conversation, is the removal of the de minimis shipping exception, which, if you're not aware of this, is basically this, I believe, $800 or below exception, which is what has enabled quite a lot of ultra fast fashion companies, I should say, to expand and grow the way that they have. And certainly that was not the U.S. government's intent or main intent behind that, removing that shipping exception. Their intent was not to sort of look at it from a sustainability perspective. I'm quite certain. However, and I should also mention that this is harmful for a lot of U.S. small businesses, so it's not an overall sort of win. But certainly that is going to make it more difficult for some of these super ultra fast fashion companies to be shipping directly to the U.S. So even if inadvertently, that's something that is kind of playing into this overall discussion of reimagining growth now as well. So to answer your question, Michael, I think policymakers absolutely have a huge and critical role to play in this. I think the way that we talk about policy at Textile Exchange is that it's really always important to strike the right balance of aspirational and realistic with policy. So, ensuring that policymakers are aware of kind of the realities of the industry today, but while also trying to push forward and make those policies that are forthcoming as aspirational as possible within the realities that the industry faces today. So maybe I'll pause there, but yeah, certainly, as with all of this, with any sort of sustainability topic, we talk about the big systems change that's needed will only happen with the support of good, thoughtful policy in key jurisdictions that are helping push that forward.
Right. Thanks for outlining or listing a number of the policy interventions that are happening. Obviously, in the EU and France, there are a range of things happening. The textile strategy, which explicitly says to address, sort of fast fashion. At the same time, the strategy was also a competitive strategy, right, to enable the European industry to thrive as well. So there are some potential conflicts there in terms of being able to achieve both. And again, I think this is for part 2 of our conversation.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing, Michael?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, just on the policy side of things, I mean, obviously, as we know, this is so complex. And whilst, as you just rightly pointed out, there's various different contradictory elements, and this is kind of the whole point of this very topic. But one of the things I just wanted to add is that I do also think there are some headwinds from a broader perspective outside of the fashion and textile industry, in the sense that, we know this is not something, as Beth mentioned earlier, that the industry can achieve alone, let alone a single brand can achieve alone, and that it's a market level shift that we're talking about. But there are some headwinds there, and I think when you look from a broader perspective at the intergovernmental level, there are lots of very interesting conversations happening about this topic of growth and about this idea of shifting from that focus on GDP, the sort of typical measure of growth, towards looking at how we sustain ecosystems and improve well-being. And the report goes into some of the examples of this, but one of the ones I wanted to point out that I thought was incredibly interesting that came out last year as well was a report from the United Nations Environment Programme and the International Science Council that stated that a new global emphasis is needed on well-being metrics rather than pure economic growth in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Right.
So with my optimist hat on, I think there is some momentum there, which I think we can take a note of inspiration from and consider for our industry. And
Yes.
then one final extra thing I wanted to say, if I can, is just that to your point about the role that business has to play and trying to understand where we're coming from with this report, there is also another angle in the report that we haven't had time to go into, but I wanted to mention with one sentence, which just is to say that, as Beth mentioned about that piece on value creation opportunity, there is also a very big motivator in the industry doing this in terms of the financial risks associated with not doing so. So we have a whole section that talks about the cost of inaction. So,
Right.
if they don't move forward on this, what are the impacts on operating profits in terms of supply chain instability, resource depletion, and so forth, but also costs that are coming down the line in terms of some of that legislation that we've just mentioned in different regions around the world.
Okay. Very interesting. Yes, I'm also quite aware, which is nice, of at least in Europe, a number of conversations, serious conversations going on, focused on the well-being framework, and often driven by organizations like the Club of Rome still and others. So I think there is a group of people, a strong group of people who are moving that, and I get a sense at some level in the EU there is uh, a receptiveness to that still, unlike in the United States, as I perceive it. But so I'm aware, I think, of the bigger context, and I think our listeners should be aware of the bigger context. And for some reason, it makes me think that the only way to ensure that this doesn't drown in the usual backlash of, maximize profits and forget about what we've talking about is to keep the narrative going, to keep the discussion going, to make it more of a norm rather than an exception. And obviously, that's an art in and of itself. So, although we could be talking again for more hours now, I'm thinking as we wrap up, is there something that you think is the next step? Are you thinking about the next steps already based on the landscape analysis? Are there things you concretely are going to do? Or are you hoping for some help and inspiration from other actors? What are you thinking in terms of the next steps here?
Yeah. So just very briefly, as mentioned earlier, the intent with this landscape analysis report was always to provide that shared grounding, basically, in what do we know, what do we not know about the topic, and kind of where do we need to go from here, or at least what do we need to explore in terms of next steps. So, we've laid that all out already in the pathways, at least briefly. And so I think our next steps are really to actively explore collective action opportunities within the industry, building on what we've laid out in the landscape analysis report. And as I mentioned earlier, Textile Exchange is very clear that we know we will not be able to address this topic alone, and nor will our industry be able to address this topic alone. So, we're actively exploring collective action opportunities with other industry organizations and organizations beyond, who cover more than just our industry as well, to think about what are some of these practical pathways. We're having some initial, kind of discussions with some of the folks we know in the industry who are really leading on this topic and who are thinking about it and talking about it internally, and are taking meaningful actions within their businesses. So yeah, working on all of that now. We want to step into this in a way that is effective and efficient, and is fit for purpose for this moment in time as well, I guess I would say, and is effective for businesses in this moment in time. But yeah, absolutely looking at all of the pathways and kind of where can different organizations help support. Again, as Textile Exchange, we would really lean into the sort of raw materials extraction side of things, and improving the practices there. But there are all these other pathways that Rachel laid out that are certainly not areas of focus for Textile Exchange specifically. So I guess our hope is that this report provides kind of a centralized reference point for, again, what do we know, what do we not know, and where do we need to go from here? And we can all kind of start to coordinate really meaningful actions using the report.
Rachel and Beth, thank you very much for putting together a very professional, clear pedagogic report, for taking very complex ideas and putting them in the context of this industry. That's pretty impressive, in my opinion, and for driving this often not so easy topic to discuss, and for breaking new ground there, at least at minimum in our industry. So thank you for that. And we will make the report, of course, available like it is on your websites in conjunction with this podcast. And hopefully we can continue the work ahead together. So thank you both very much for the conversation.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for having us.